On September 26, 2002, a routine ferry voyage turned into a national catastrophe. That night, the Senegalese ferry MV Le Joola, carrying hundreds of passengers, capsized off the coast of the Gambia without warning. In the chaos, thousands were thrown into darkness and despair. Over 1,860 people perished, a death toll that surpassed even that of the Titanic, which sank 90 years earlier. Astonishingly, only around 64 people survived the disaster. Among them was Mariama Diop, notable as the sole female survivor, plucked from the oily waters after enduring the night. Another survivor, Aliou Cissé, now known as Senegal's national football coach, lost 11 members of his own family in the tragedy, a personal horror echoing through an entire generation. This little-known ferry disaster is recognized as the second worst non-wartime maritime disaster in world history, taking more lives than the infamous Titanic. Yet, outside of Senegal, the story of Le Joola remains largely forgotten, a painful memory often overshadowed by other disasters. 20 years on, the wounds from that night are still raw for the families of the victims, even as the world barely remembers. This is the story of Africa's Titanic, the shipwreck they tried to forget.
Could one of the deadliest shipwrecks in history remain so unknown to the world?
Le Joola's final voyage began like any other. That afternoon, the ferry departed from Ziguinchor, a town in Senegal's southern Casamance region, bound for the capital, Dakar. The ferry was critically overloaded, officially built to carry a maximum of 536 passengers. It departed with well over 1,900 people crammed on board. Passengers included students heading to universities, traders with their goods, families, tourists, and even soldiers. Many sought the Joola as a lifeline, since the ferry was the only convenient link between Casamance and the rest of Senegal, due to a separatist conflict that made land travel dangerous. No one imagined that by boarding the ship, they were stepping onto a floating time bomb of tragedy. As night fell, the weather worsened. Rain lashed and winds picked up as the Joola steamed north along the coast. Near midnight, the ferry sailed directly into a violent storm. Huge waves and gale-force winds began to batter the top-heavy vessel. Inside the lower decks, hundreds of people were likely unaware of the impending crisis, as the ferry suddenly listed sharply to one side. Cargo and passengers shifted, the overloaded ship lost its balance. In a matter of moments, Le Joola rolled onto its side and capsized. Those on the open deck were flung into the rough seas. Those inside found themselves trapped as water rushed in. With horrifying swiftness, the Joola flipped upside down and sank into the Atlantic's shallow waters, its hull partially submerged a mere 20 meters below the surface. For the few who survived the capsizing, the nightmare had only begun. In the darkness, dozens clung to the upturned hull or to debris, fighting to stay afloat through the night. Parents gripped children who slipped away in the waves. Friends lost sight of each other amid the rain and blackness. Some survivors later recalled hearing the cries of hundreds trapped inside gradually fade into silence. The vast majority of passengers were caught below decks with no chance to escape. In those awful hours, Le Joola became an underwater tomb for entire families.
What caused a modern ferry on a routine voyage to capsize so suddenly and disastrously? Was it just the storm, or did human negligence seal the Joola's fate?
Dawn broke on September 27, 2002, to reveal a scene of unimaginable grief. Where a bustling ferry full of life had been, there was now only an overturned hull, partially jutting from the shallow sea off the Gambian coast. Local fishermen and pirogues were among the first on the scene at first light, rescuing a handful of people clinging to wreckage. News of the disaster slowly reached shore and spread like wildfire. At the port of Ziguinchor, anxious crowds gathered, desperate for information about their loved ones who had been on board. When the authorities finally announced that Le Joola had capsized, shock and disbelief gripped the town. For many, the reality was too harrowing to accept. Parents searching for children, children searching for parents, all met with silence.
The immediate aftermath of the sinking, why did help come so slowly? Could more lives have been saved in those crucial hours right after the disaster?
In the days that followed, Senegal was plunged into mourning. Families traveled from all over the country to Ziguinchor and the coastal villages of the Gambia, hoping against hope to find survivors or at least recover the bodies of their loved ones. Tragically, of the over 1,800 victims, very few bodies were ever formally identified. Many were laid to rest in mass game graves, as the sheer number of dead overwhelmed local capacity. The streets of Ziguinchor, a town that lost nearly half of the 19,000 victims, filled with funeral processions and the sounds of collective grieving. One school in the town mourned 150 students and teachers lost to the tragedy. An entire generation of youth gone in one night. Survivors and families were inconsolable. As one witness recalled, no one could console anyone. People were tearing at their clothes, wailing. Some even threatened to throw themselves into the sea. Such was the depth of despair that grief itself became a second wave devastating the community. Amidst the mourning, anger and frustration began to build. Victims' families and survivors started asking pointed questions. How could this happen? Who was responsible for allowing the Joola to carry so many people? They learned that official rescue operations did not arrive until many hours after the sinking, a delay that likely cost additional lives. The Sunmai. In Ziguinchor, this slow response and lack of immediate support felt like a betrayal. To many, it seemed as if the authorities had abandoned their own people in their hour of greatest need. A national outpouring of grief soon turned into public outrage. Memorial services were held across Senegal, including a state ceremony. But many families were dissatisfied. They demanded answers and accountability. The press and community leaders dubbed the government's handling of the tragedy a second shipwreck, a failure nearly as painful as the disaster itself. For the people of Senegal, Le Joola was not just a ferry, it was a symbol of negligence and unheeded warnings. Reports emerged that the ferry had been poorly maintained and habitually overloaded, and that night it ventured out despite weather warnings. These revelations deepened the sense of injustice. Portraits of lost loved ones in hand, mothers and fathers confronted officials, demanding to know why such a catastrophe was allowed to happen.
Would the Joola tragedy have been any less devastating if officials had acted faster or heeded the warning signs earlier? What did the official inquiries conclude? And did they truly uncover the real causes of the Joola sinking, or merely find a convenient scapegoat?
In the months after the disaster, the Senegalese government moved to close the book on Le Joola. By 2003, the official investigation was concluded, and its findings placed blame squarely on one individual, the ferry's captain, who went down with his ship, the Sun. The report cited a litany of probable causes: engine failure, navigational error, bad weather, poor maintenance, and blatant overcrowding. But ultimately, no living person was held accountable. With the captain dead and unable to defend himself, the case was effectively closed with no prosecutions of any officials or operators involved in running the ferry. Government ministers who oversaw the ferry operations and the naval officers responsible for safety were never criminally charged. To the families of victims, this felt like a hollow resolution, a quick political fix that denied them true justice. Internationally, the disaster gained only brief attention. 18 French citizens were among the dead, prompting a French judicial investigation, evidence that the tragedy was not due to one man alone, But after years of legal wrangling, French courts dismissed the case, citing lack of jurisdiction. Once again, no one was held legally responsible. The phrase, "questions remain," continued to haunt the survivors. Why had the ferry been allowed to depart in such conditions? Who approved its overloading? Why were there not enough life vests or lifeboats, and why did rescue come so late? These questions met only silence from the authorities, who seemed eager to put the incident behind them. As the media frenzy died down, the government's posture appeared to shift toward forgetting. Leaders urged the country to heal and move on. Public commemorations were toned down in subsequent years. The wreck of Le Joola itself remained lying on the seabed, clearly visible and relatively accessible in just 20 meters of water, yet it was left untouched as a mass grave. Despite early promises, efforts to raise the sunken ship never materialized. Some say because it would stir up painful memories and political liability. Senegalese president at the time, Abdoulaye Wade, and later President Macky Sall, direct engagement with the subject beyond the initial condolences. In fact, President Sall never once attended the annual memorial services in Ziguinchor since taking office. To the victims' families, this lack of acknowledgement felt like salt on a wound. Their grief had been met with denial and their pleas for accountability met with indifference. The message they perceived was clear. The nation's leadership would the Joola tragedy be forgotten.
When those in power choose to forget a tragedy, what does that mean for the survivors and victims' families? Does moving on require forgetting or remembering?
For the families of the Joola's victims and the few survivors, forgetting has never been an option. In the 2 decades since the sinking, they have worked tirelessly to keep the memory of the disaster alive. Each year on the anniversary, September 26th, hundreds gather in Ziguinchor and other cities for somber memorial ceremonies. They light candles, recite the names of those lost, and pray together by the Casamance River. For them, as one grieving daughter put it, from 2002 till today, there has not been a day when I haven't thought about the boat. The Joola lives on in their hearts and nightmares, a wound that never heals. Associations in Senegal and abroad, including France and Germany, home to some victims, have banded together to demand 2 things. They continue to press the government to raise the wreck of Le Joola from the ocean, both to recover the remains still inside and to give the ship a proper place in history, not hidden under waves but acknowledged on land. They also advocate for a permanent memorial. In fact, the Senegalese government once promised to build a national memorial museum for the Joola tragedy. Plans were drawn, and a site in Ziguinchor was chosen. Meant to open by the 15th anniversary, but today that site remains unfinished. Nowhere near ready, even by the 20th anniversary. Despite the setbacks, the community's determination has spurred other forms of remembrance. Artists and writers have commemorated the disaster in poems, songs, and novels, rescuing the story of Le Joola from oblivion through literature and art. Documentaries like this one and international news features periodically shine a spotlight, often calling it Africa's Titanic, to underline how the scale of loss rivaled that famous disaster, even if the Joola never received the same global attention. This belated recognition, however, is bittersweet. Families ask only that their loved ones not be forgotten, and that lessons be learned so that such a preventable tragedy never happens again. On a grassy bluff overlooking the harbor in Ziguinchor stands a modest memorial plaque with the names of some of the victims. It is not grand or well-known, but locals visit it regularly, leaving flowers and spending a quiet moment in reflection. Memory lives on in these small acts. In the end, the story of Le Joola endures because ordinary people, mothers, fathers, siblings, friends, refuse to let it die. In keeping the flame of remembrance alive, they ensure that the shipwreck the world tried to forget is etched forever in Senegal's collective consciousness.
Can remembering the Joola help prevent future disasters and bring peace to those left behind.
Survivors recall clinging to debris, praying in the dark. Many were children who watched their parents drown. Others were traders who floated for hours before fishermen found them. One survivor said, "I still hear the screams in my sleep." Fishermen risked their lives to save strangers. Villagers opened their homes. Teachers, doctors, and even journalists helped identify the dead. Some raised money for orphaned children, others simply listened.
Why do we rarely hear about the heroes of this tragedy? What do their actions say about the spirit of African communities?
More people died on Le Joola than on the Titanic, but the silence around it is even more tragic. We remember them now. We tell their story. Behind every number was a name, a dream, a life. We honor not only the dead, but the love they left behind. If you believe these lives mattered, and stories like this should not be forgotten, like, share, and subscribe to CennEntertainment. Let the world know Africa's stories deserve to be heard.